Imagine for a second you're sitting down to play a really high-stakes board game. One of those cooperative ones with like an inch-thick rule book.
Okay.
And the main rule, the whole point of the game, is that to make any big move to advance your piece, buy a property, whatever, you both have to agree. You can't move unless your partner says yes.
Sounds like a recipe for a very long and potentially very frustrating game night.
Oh, absolutely. You're ready to flip the table, but then you're reading the fine print, the dusty pages at the back nobody ever looks at, and you find a secret rule. It says basically, if you disagree and you wait long enough and you say it loud enough, you can just ignore your partner and move the piece anyway.
The cheat code.
It feels exactly like a cheat code, a get-out-of-jail-free card. But today we are finding out that in the British Parliament, this cheat code is real. But, and this is the big but, the source material we're diving into suggests that using it might actually cost you the game.
That is the perfect way to frame it, because that power to override your partner, it exists, but it's definitely not free.
Right.
The price tag is usually, political turmoil, public outcry, a lot of wasted time.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We are tackling a mechanism today that sounds so dramatic, this political nuclear option, where the elected House of Commons can force a law through, even if the House of Lords completely objects. We're working off a fascinating article, The Safety Valve, Reforming the Commons' Override Power, and we're zooming in on a post called Let's Rethink the Lords. So when Parliament ignored the Lords, what actually happened?
And this is one of those topics that can feel a bit abstract until you realize it's really about how decisions get made when everything else just breaks down.
When the polite conversation stops.
Exactly.
Right. We're moving past the schoolhouse rock version of how a bill becomes a law with everyone shaking hands. We're getting into the messy, grinding reality of it. So our mission today is to answer a really practical question. When this override button gets pushed, when the Commons basically tells the Lords, thanks, but no thanks, does it lead to disaster or does it lead to success?
And I think a lot of people assume it's a simple power thing. Like, the Commons is the boss, the Lords are advisors, so the boss wins. But the source material shows it's so much more complicated. It's about delay, public scrutiny, and honestly, the surprising value of losing an argument.
The value of losing. I want to put a pin in that because that feels so counterintuitive. We have to unpack that.
Definitely.
But first, let's look back. Because this power, this override, it wasn't just invented because the Commons found the Lords, annoying one day.
No, it wasn't a convenience thing at all. It was born out of a crisis.
Yeah.
To really get this, you have to go back to the early 20th century.
The era of top hats and constitutional standoffs.
Exactly. We're talking 1909, 1910. The entire system had effectively locked up. The House of Lords, which, remember, is unelected and at that time was entirely hereditary aristocrats.
Right.
They decided to block the government's budget.
Okay, pause there. Locking the budget in a parliamentary system, that's not just arguing over the grocery bill, right?
Oh, no. It's an existential threat to the government. If you can't pass what they call money bills, you can't pay the army, you can't pay for anything, the government just ceases to function.
So the Lords were blocking a budget that the voters had clearly backed.
Yes. A total constitutional standoff. The unelected chamber was holding the car keys, refusing to let the elected driver start the engine.
Great analogy.
And that confrontation, it forced a reckoning. That crisis led directly to the Parliament Acts of 1911 and then later 1949. These acts are the rule book change you were talking about. They permanently shifted the power dynamic.
They created the mechanism for the Commons to say, we represent the people and we are going to proceed without you.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core metaphor in the source material, which I think is so helpful. It calls this override power a safety valve.
A safety valve.
Yeah, think about what a safety valve does on an old steam engine. You don't use it to drive the train.
Right.
It doesn't make the wheels turn.
Right. It's there to stop the boiler from exploding.
Precisely. If the pressure gets too high, if the deadlock is total and the government literally cannot govern, you pop the valve so the whole machine doesn't blow up.
So the override exists for those very specific, very rare moments. It's a deadlock breaker, not a standard way of doing business.
Exactly. It's there so the country doesn't grind to a halt.
That distinction is so key because I think there's this myth that the Prime Minister can just snap their fingers, invoke the Parliament Act, and poof, the Lords disappear.
Like a magic wand. Yeah, no, it is definitely not a snap of the fingers. The source is very clear on this. The process is designed to be painful, a real slog.
Okay, so how do you do it? What are the conditions?
There are really three. First, it has to be done openly. Second, it has to be done slowly. And third, it always comes at a political cost.
Openly, slowly, and at a political cost. Let's break it down slowly. Because usually when a government wants a law, they want it yesterday. They've got an election coming up.
Well, the Parliament Act usually requires a delay of about a year.
The year.
A year. You have to pass the bill in the Commons, send it to the Lords, they reject it, then you have to wait a whole session, pass it again. It's a grind.
A year is an absolute lifetime in politics.
It is. And that's the cost. It tests the government's resolve. It's asking, do you really, truly care about this enough to keep arguing about it for 12 straight months?
It also gives the public time to catch up, doesn't it? If something passes in a week, who even notices? A year, and everyone has an opinion.
That's the openly part. You can't slip this through on a quiet Tuesday night. You are forced to have this argument out in the public square day after day. You have to stand up and say, we know the experts and the Lords hate this. We know, but we're doing it anyway.
So by design, it prevents a sneak attack. It forces a big public confrontation.
It does. And the source uses a really interesting term for this. It says, using the override crystallizes the disagreement.
Crystallizes. That's a great word choice. Usually politics is about fudge, right? Ambiguity. We're considering all options.
Exactly. Politics is normally fluid. You can compromise here, tweak that. But when you use the override, you are freezing that fluid. You're turning the argument into a hard, solid object.
You're making a final choice.
You are. The government is making a conscious choice to own the consequences. They're signing their name to it in bold red ink, and they can't blame anyone else later.
They can't say, oh, the Lords watered it down.
Nope. You passed exactly what you wanted. You own every single comma.
Okay, so that leads to the big question. When a government does this, when they force something through and ignore all the warnings, does it work? Do we get better laws?
This is where you really want a simple yes or no answer, don't you?
Heroes and villains. It's an easier story to follow.
Of course. We want to hear the Commons represents the people, they're always right, or the Lords are the wise elders, ignoring them is always a disaster.
But I'm guessing it's not that simple.
The honest answer from the source is, it's mixed. And the details of why it's mixed are just fascinating.
So give us the scorecard. When has it actually worked out?
Well, looking back, some decisions that were pushed through were later seen as, necessary. Some constitutional changes, for example, that the Lords resisted just out of tradition.
Being stick in the muds.
Basically, yeah. And history looked back and said, okay, the Commons was right to force that. It dragged the institution into the modern world.
So sometimes the safety valve works as intended. It clears a blockage. But what about the other times?
Other times, the legislation aged badly.
Aged badly like milk left out in the sun.
Exactly like that. And here's the crucial part. They aged badly in the exact specific ways that the Lords predicted they would.
Oof. That is damning. That's the ultimate I told you so.
It is. The source points out that often the warnings raised during that scrutiny phase, the ones the Commons ignored, ended up looking incredibly reasonable 5 or 10 years down the line.
Like what kind of warnings?
Things like, this will be impossible to enforce, or this creates a massive loophole, or this violates this specific right. And lo and behold, 5 years later,
it's a complete mess.
It's a complete mess.
Yeah.
There's a quote in the notes here that just stopped me in my tracks. The debates themselves often age better than the outcomes.
Wow. Say that again.
The debates themselves often age better than the outcomes. It suggests that the people who lost the vote actually won the argument.
That totally challenges how we think about winning in politics, doesn't it? We just look at who got the bill signed, the final score.
Right. But if you go back and read the transcripts years later, you find some peer in the House of Lords flagged the exact risk, the civil liberties problem, the logistical nightmare that eventually sank the whole thing.
So the law might have been a failure, but the debate was a success because it correctly identified why it would fail.
Precisely. And this is where we have to reframe the whole system. Because if you're listening, you might be thinking, well, if the Commons can just ignore them anyway, what is the point of the Lords? Why even show up?
It feels like shouting into the void, like writing a strongly worded letter that you know is going straight into the shredder.
You can feel that way. But the source argues that the scrutiny matters immensely, even when it fails to stop the law. We have to change our definition of value.
So the value isn't just stopping the car.
No. The value is in the paper trail.
Okay, the paper trail. Explain why that matters to someone who just wants good roads and schools.
Because that scrutiny, that debate, it forces all the arguments out into the open. It clarifies the trade-offs. It creates a clear historical record of what was known at the time.
So the government can't turn around 5 years later and say, whoops, nobody told us that would happen. We had no idea.
Exactly that. It removes the excuse of ignorance. And for accountability in a democracy, that is a crucial, crucial mechanism.
It makes the decision willful. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice.
It sharpens the responsibility. That's the phrase the source uses. It doesn't erase the government's power, but it highlights their liability. It creates a visible trail showing who raised concerns and who chose to set them aside.
That's a powerful way to look at it. The override isn't a silencing tool, it's a spotlight tool. It puts a giant spotlight on the decision makers.
And that spotlight is exactly why this power is so rarely used.
That was my next question. Because if I have a win button in a board game, I am tempted to press it every single time. But you're saying the Commons almost never uses this?
Because of that political cost we talked about, if overriding the Lords were easy or quick or consequence-free, governments would do it all the time. The Lords would just become a rubber stamp.
They'd just be window dressing.
But because it requires that year of delay, all that public attention and that crystallization of the argument, it acts as a massive deterrent. The threat of the override actually does more work than the override itself.
It's like nuclear deterrence. You have the weapon so you never have to use it?
In a way, yes. The whole design encourages compromise. You hear about parliamentary ping-pong where a bill goes back and forth. Most disagreements don't end with a nuclear override.
They end in a quiet deal.
A quiet deal, a small adjustment, a compromise. The government looks at the pain of waiting a year, of all the bad press, and thinks, you know what? Maybe we just accept this one small amendment from the Lords and move on.
It forces them to negotiate because the alternative is just too much of a headache.
Correct. It's a last resort. Its rarity isn't a bug, it's a feature. It ensures the Lords can be consequential without being supreme. They can force the Commons to think twice, but they can't stop the elected government from governing.
That's a really clever balance. But the source doesn't just leave it there, does it? It ends on a pretty heavy philosophical note.
It really does. It pivots from the mechanics to a problem. And I think this is where we should focus as we wrap up, because this affects anyone who cares about how we make good decisions as a society.
Yeah, the conclusion of the article posed a question that I'm still chewing on. It's about the burden we're placing on the Lords.
Think about the role we've just described. We're asking the House of Lords to surface ethical concerns. We ask them to identify long-term risks, to point out uncomfortable trade-offs that an elected government might want to ignore.
They're supposed to be the conscience or the long-term thinkers in the room, right? They don't have to worry about getting reelected.
Exactly. But as we've spent this whole time discussing, the system is designed so that if the government is stubborn enough, all those hard truths can just be brushed aside.
The government can just say, thanks for the ethics lesson, but we're doing it anyway.
So the question the source asks is this: is the House of Lords really the best place in our system for that kind of work to live?
What do you mean?
I mean, if their job is to raise these huge ethical red flags, but they ultimately have no power to actually stop the train, is that a flaw in the design itself?
That cuts deep. Are we setting them up to fail? We're saying, your job is to stop bad things from happening, but then we give the other guy a button that says, ignore the stop sign.
Precisely. We treat them as a check on power, but we gave the power holders a way to bypass the check. It raises this question of whether we need a different way to handle those long-term risk conversations.
Maybe a mechanism where being right about the risks actually carries more weight than just leaving a paper trail for historians.
That's the question. It's easy to say reform the Lords. Everyone says that. But what do we actually want them to do? Do we want them to advise? Or do we want them to hold the brakes?
It's the central tension, isn't it? Efficiency versus scrutiny. You need to move fast enough to solve problems, but slow enough to avoid creating new ones.
And understanding the override power helps us see that the system is designed to be messy. It's designed to be a struggle. And maybe that struggle, that friction, is where the real value is.
It prevents the government from being too efficient at making mistakes.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, there you have it. The nuclear option isn't quite what it seems. It's not a magic wand. It's a safety valve, a spotlight, and a deterrent, all in one.
And a reminder that in politics, even when you lose the vote, you might just win the argument in the history books.
I love that. Winning the argument in the history books. It's a cold comfort, maybe, but an important one. Thank you so much for breaking all this down with me.
My pleasure. It's always worth looking under the hood.
And thank you, our listener, for diving deep with us. We will catch you on the next one. Take care.